Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our second webinar in the 2026 AI and Virtual Nursing webinar series. As we begin today's presentation, please note that you can feel free to drop questions in the chat at any point in time during the presentation, but we are going to hold those questions until the end, where we will be having plenty of time for Q&A. We'll field your questions at that time. If you want to unmic and ask a live question, you're welcome to do so as well. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Michael Rowe. Michael is the Director of Teaching and Learning in the School of Health and Care Sciences at the University of Lincoln in the United Kingdom. His scholarship focuses on the transformative potential of digital technologies in professional education, with an emphasis on how they mediate relationships between teachers and students in learning environments. More recently, he has concentrated on the implication of generative AI in higher education and professional practice. So with that, I would like to turn this over to Michael, and he can take you on your journey. Welcome.
Thanks very much. Thanks for the opportunity. I'm just going to hide these panels. Okay, can you see my screen okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. So thank you for the opportunity to share some ideas around AI in learning. The presentation I'm going to give today is informed by conversations that I've had with colleagues, mostly in nursing actually, but in some of the other health professions as well, where people express this concern about the work. What is the work that students are doing if we bring AI into the classroom? And what space does that leave for students to do the work? And so I spent quite a lot of time thinking about what we mean by the work. And it kind of struck me that there's this alignment problem between what we say we value and the kinds of learning tasks we give our students. We say that we think that this one thing is important, but we actually pay all of our attention to this other thing. And it turns out that our concern with AI is actually about the other thing, not about what we say we value. So I'm going to kind of dig into that idea throughout the presentation. I kind of start out with this kind of quote that I quite like. We spend an enormous amount of effort trying to support our students and trying to improve their learning environments. I think that we don't do this very well, though. I think that the learning environments that we create in professional education spaces leave a lot to be desired, and they don't really align with what we know from theory to be kind of, the best context for student learning. But regardless, sometimes learning does happen. And this kind of is a good thing and a bad thing. It kind of means that for a student who's engaged and motivated, there's almost nothing I can do that's going to stop them from learning. For a student who's disengaged and unmotivated, it doesn't really matter what I do, they're probably not going to learn. So how do we use our space in the classroom? How do we use their classroom environment and the relationship that we have with students to build different kinds of environments that better support student engagement and motivation? So we find ourselves in this really disorienting moment. In November 2021, OpenAI released ChatGPT, and things just haven't been the same since then. I've just given some examples to give a flavor of the kinds of things that AI is able to do at the moment. It can pass nursing and medical licensing exams in the 90th percentile. So it's better than almost everyone else taking those exams. It can produce care plans, reflective portfolios, and clinical case analyses that satisfy the basic assessment criteria that we use. So almost all the things that we give students to do to demonstrate their competence and understanding, these are things that they can just outsource to AI. There was a really interesting proof of concept that came out a couple of years ago already. Someone demonstrated that you could give an AI agent your login credentials for your institutional learning management system. The AI would log in on your behalf, navigate through all of your courses, download all of the documentation required for your assessment tasks, complete those assessment tasks, and resubmit them on your behalf. And I remember at the time, people were saying, well, the AI only got 60%. And yet all the student had to do was give this wasn't a student, it was a lecturer who did this proof of concept. But all that you had to do was give the AI your login credentials. Blinded clinicians are rating AI responses to real patient questions as more empathic than physicians' responses. And so it kind of gives you a sense of this idea that we hold close to ourselves, the notion that we are really good at empathy, at creativity, and yet when we're kind of testing those beliefs, it seems that AI is actually outperforming humans in a lot of those metrics. Students now have 24/7 access to AI tutors that can give them adaptive responses. So these are not the same responses that every student gets. These are responses that the AI gives to students based on their specific context. And AI feedback is more consistent than most human assessors. There's some interesting work that's being done where students prefer AI feedback in some contexts and human feedback in other contexts. So it's not really a case of one is better than the other. They're different kinds of feedback and they can both be valuable. And it kind of foregrounds some of what I'm going to talk about a little bit later, which is that we're not really in competition with AI, or we can put ourselves in competition with AI, but that probably isn't optimal. And then there was a really interesting paper where researchers submitted I don't know how many papers it was, but a significant number of papers into a BSc psychology program, and 94% of those AI written submissions were undetected, and the AI submissions outscored the real students by some significant margin. So even when we are using AI detection, we can use AI to prepare outputs that are invisible to AI detectors. And when I talk to colleagues about what's happening in professional education, I see a lot of people retreating to these what I call sanctuary strategies. People try to find solace and safety and comfort in these kinds of conversations. So they deny that AI is going to take over certain kinds of things. They hold that there are some things that are just human, and this isn't really something that AI is going to be able to replace. So even if we can say that AI is never going to replace clinical judgment, I would say, well, I'm not really that confident that what we do in the university develops clinical judgment in the first place. It also doesn't resolve the problem of AI being able to do almost all the assessments that we give students today. We can retreat, and so we can focus on what only humans can do. So we can say, what are all the things that AI can do today? And we will focus our attention on the things that AI can't do. The problem with this is that every time a frontier lab releases a new language model, that space for us gets smaller and smaller because AI is just getting better and better. And so it creates, if we are only ever going to evaluate our contribution against what AI can't do, we're just painting ourselves into a smaller and smaller corner, and the space for human contribution in learning interactions just gets less and less. We can try to restrict students from using AI. So we're already seeing kind of policies all around the world where universities are saying that students are not allowed to use AI. My institution's just released a policy based on a traffic light system. So we have to categorize assessments into red, amber, or green. Red is you're not allowed to use any AI for this. Green is you can use AI for whatever you want. And orange is kind of this really gray area where nobody can really explain well what it means to use AI for these specific things. So if AI is built into your operating system and you're talking to your operating system rather than using a keyboard and a mouse and generating your assessment using your assessment submission that way, is that using AI? Of course it is. Is it using it in a way that is banned? It's very difficult to say. Uh, I think that this is going to force people towards just choosing the red option because that's the simplest. The problem is that if students use AI and sign the declaration saying they didn't use it, there's no way for us to actually determine whether or not they used AI. So the restriction approach, I think, is really problematic. We weren't able to stop people using the internet, and if you were around at the time when the internet was kind of starting to emerge, I was a student when it first started to emerge and a lecturer when it became mainstream. We had policies that said students are not allowed to use the internet, and of course they all did. And now we think it was quaint that at the time we tried to stop them. I think in a few years' time, we'll look back and think it's weird that we tried to stop students using AI. Um, I think people sometimes resign themselves to the fact that AI is just getting better and better, and they think that their roles will diminish. But I think of performance as a non zero-sum game. So instead of thinking of AI as this, or instead of thinking of all the things that we can do as the circle, and AI is just taking up more and more space within that circle, you could think of AI as a platform that you're standing on. And as AI gets better, so your ability to perform, to reach further, to dig deeper, that improves. It gets better. And so AI could be this kind of springboard that allows us and our students to do a lot more with a lot less, for example. So this talk is kind of based on these four premises, which I think are fairly uncontroversial. Learning results from what the student does and thinks, and only from what the student does and thinks. And all the other stuff around it is decoration. The only thing that really drives a student's learning and understanding about the world is what they do and think about. There's a series of connections that goes on in their brains, and we have to try and create a space that supports their ability to create those connections. That's all that teaching is. We want to create conditions that influence what students do and think to guide them in the direction where they can get more synaptic connections in their brains. All that assessment is an attempt to infer learning from observable patterns in what students do and think. We can't see what's going on inside their brains. We can only ever observe what they do. And then universities just certify those attempts and they try to make judgments about students' future performance. We have a certain amount of confidence that student X is going to make a really good clinician when they graduate. We have lower confidence that other kinds of students are going to do well after they graduate. That's all that certification really is. AI hasn't really changed any of these premises. The only thing that AI is starting to, I think, make inroads in is the last one, certification. As if universities don't change the way that we think about assessment, then the value of the degree is just going to keep getting lower and lower. There's just a couple of days ago, there was a report that came out in the UK just saying that 30% of people in the UK don't think a university degree is worth it. And one of the reasons for that was the impact of AI, not only on the trust that people have in what the degree certifies, but in students' ability to get work afterwards. There's so much work, entry-level work that's being done by AI at the moment. So we're seeing this really, I think, significant disruption, not only in the kind of professional education space, but also in the world in which our students are graduating into. So when we think of what it means to become a nurse, the language of the profession says that it's about care, fitness to practice, professional identity, judgment. But these are all formation concepts. They're not assessment outcomes. These are very difficult things to assess. Becoming is a transformational process. The person who completes the program is different from the person who began it. And this is what I mean when I talk about this alignment problem. We've got this process of becoming. We want people to change their identity, to be different, but we've built an entire infrastructure that's designed around evaluating artifact production rather than identity formation. We use the artifacts that the students produce as a proxy for the developmental process that we actually care about. So I said earlier, we can't observe learning directly. Knowledge is built through effortful retrieval, not exposure. So getting people to sit in a classroom is, in my opinion, useless. We hope that maybe by sitting in the classroom, they may, I don't know, learn things through osmosis. But what I was saying earlier is if a student is unmotivated and disconnected, then it doesn't matter how much time they spend in the classroom. They're not going to learn anything. The only thing that really gets them to learn something is repeated effortful activation that increases synaptic connection in their brains. The conditions that feel harder produce better long-term outcomes. We need to have a desirable difficulty. We need students to cognitively engage in difficult activities. Then student engagement is a proxy for improved learning outcomes. When the engagement produces artifacts that serve as evidence of the engagement, we can trust those artifacts because the students went through cognitive difficulty to produce them. That work of learning and the artifact it produced is reliably connected. When the students engage, then the outputs that they produce say something. We can have some confidence in what those outputs mean. If a student spends several hours writing an essay, we may not be able to know exactly what's going on in their brains, but we know that there is a bigger likelihood that they have learned something than the student who only spent 30 minutes writing an essay. Now, there's obviously quite a lot of moving parts in something like that. But the proxy stands, the proxy holds when we're confident that the students had to do work to produce the output, to produce the artifact. And we all know what that feeling feels like. We know what it's like to engage with difficult problems. We know what it feels like to struggle and to come out the other side. And if you think about some of your most transformative learning experiences, I'm willing to bet that they didn't come when you were sitting in a classroom listening to someone talk at you for 2 hours. I'm pretty sure that it involved some kind of embodied engagement. You were probably moving around, doing something, talking to someone. There would have been a relational component. And this is not to say that only those kinds of learning experiences can be transformative. Of course, you can have a transformative learning experience by reading a book, by listening to a lecture. But the likelihood is that our students need to be engaged in tasks that feel cognitively difficult, that feel uncertain. Um, I really like this idea of Donald Schoen. He talks about swampy lowland. He talks about the swampy lowland of practice, and I'm kind of stealing that a little bit to talk about the swampy lowland of assessment. But he contrasts being kind of in the weeds with being up on a plateau and being able to see have a perfect view of everything. Um, and we like to think that assessment is standing up on that plateau where we have this perfect view. But the reality is that assessment has always had these really deep flaws, and we've just accepted those flaws as manageable imprecision. We've always had validity and reliability problems with assessment. We have arbitrary cut scores where we decide that 40% is the pass mark for all of our assessments, even though every assessment task at every level should have a different cut score because there's different levels of difficulty for all of those tasks. We're assessing people in different domains, but we have the same pass mark, which doesn't make any kind of sense when you look at the psychometric data. There are problems with inter-rater variability, where different people will give students different marks. There are order effects. So I'm sure that you've all had the experience where you're grading a student, and by the time you get to the third or fourth assessment that you are grading, you go back to the first one because you realize that the first one that you thought was really good is actually not really that good relative to all these other students that you're now starting to see. And then there are extraneous factors. So there's some really good evidence that the grade that a student gets is probably going to be influenced more than extraneous factors affecting the lecturer than the piece of work itself. I know that if I'm feeling tense or anxious or kind of emotionally triggered, that is going to have an effect on how I see student work. And it may be the case that your relationship with your spouse has a bigger impact on student outcomes than the work that they've done. And that doesn't really seem to be a good state of affairs. We know that most feedback doesn't translate to improved performance. Most of our assessment tasks are isolated and discrete, disconnected from each other. They don't form a coherent whole, where a student is able to move through each of those assessment tasks as some kind of a process leading towards some kind of capstone outcome. We need to remember that what we call cheating is defined relative to what we expect students to do themselves. Cheating isn't an inherent property of a task. So if I say that using AI for assessment is cheating, then it is. But if I say that using AI for assessment is not cheating, then it is not. And so we can decide to redefine what assessment means and whether or not AI should be a part of that. I can imagine many scenarios where I use AI to produce an output and I'm deeply engaged in the production of that artifact. Or I can use AI to not engage at all. But the same is true before AI. I could outsource the writing of my essay to an essay mill, which is what people are using AI for now. And I wouldn't have any engagement as part of the production of that artifact. And so if you look at it like that, there's so much research that's coming out where people are kind of publishing results saying, look, these students outsourced their thinking to AI and they didn't learn anything. Well, we didn't need research to tell us that if you don't do the work, if you don't cognitively engage, then you're not going to learn anything. And it just seems weird that we think that AI is special in this regard when we've always had students who outsource that thinking. Students have copied homework for as long as we've had homework. And yet we think that AI is somehow different. Students have always optimized for grades over learning. We've built a system that tells them that grades matter, learning doesn't. We may say the words that learning matters, but the only thing we pay attention to is grades. This is information that we need to take in about the system, not about our students. Um, that proxy has become a target. The artifact has become a target. And when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. We've confused extraneous load with germane load. So extraneous load is when we bombard the student with information that isn't really relevant about their learning, whereas germane load is information that they can use to help them make better choices about what good looks like. So, just as an example, I've looked at a few assessment briefs that we give to our students, and these can run on to 2 or 3 pages. And in in 2 or 3 pages, most of the information is extraneous load. It's not telling them anything useful about learning. It's telling them about citation formats, line spacing, font size, um, how many headings, how many references do you need to have in your reference list. This is all information that is probably useful, maybe. Um, but if we take away some of that structure and that scaffolding around the extraneous load, we can create more space for the students to think carefully about what good looks like. When we provide model answers and micro criteria rubrics, so these are the rubrics that have so many different kind of granularities of kind of descriptors, it becomes really difficult to make a good argument for why a student falls into the 72 category rather than the 75 category. We spend all of our time having conversations about what words mean in those rubrics. We look at word counts per section and detailed assessment briefs. All of these things provide so much scaffolding for students that they don't really have to struggle to figure out what good looks like. On a side note, the more detailed we make these assessment briefs, the easier it is for the student to give that assessment brief to AI alongside the question and just have the AI do the assignment. The more we structure the work that we ask our students to do, the easier it is for them to give that work over to AI. And I want to suggest that we need to move, in Schoen's words, towards the swampy lowlands. We want our assessments to be more messy, more uncertain, more unstructured. And I think this would, I'll talk about this a little bit later, but when AI is part of that picture, we start to get a sense of how students use the AI to produce an output that they don't know is a good output. In the kind of environment that we've created, I would argue that rational students should focus on artifact production because that's what gets them good marks. That's what gets them to graduate with a first. When they produce an essay or a poster or a presentation that ticks all the boxes, that's all that assessment has become, a box ticking exercise. I think that it would be an irrational student who did not choose to take that route. So I think the proxy has failed. We know that a large majority of students in the UK, especially, have used AI for submitting and assessing their work. I think it's something like 96% in the HEPI study that was just released. Students can produce well-polished, well-referenced output without reading, engaging, or understanding. This has been the case for a while, and the more structured we make those assessment briefs, the easier it is for our students to pass without really understanding the work. If we give grades for referencing style, number of citations, those very kind of instrumental technical pieces of work, they can get grades for not really understanding anything. Fluency now has low information value. It used to be that a well-written piece of work said something about the student who did the work. They would have had to spend time thinking about word choice. They would have had to make sure that their argument follows some kind of a coherent internal logic. I think this because of that. And so we'd be able to find some of that information would come out in the quality of the work that the student produced. But quality of the output is now just noise. It doesn't tell us anything about the student. We cannot trust quality in the work that students do as any kind of indicator of their understanding. And this is because we've optimized the system to value the artifact. We've created a structural problem that incentivizes misaligned behavior. Learning is no longer important. Producing the polished artifact is the behavior that the whole system has been designed to create. So the conditions that made the proxy work in the past no longer hold because students now have access to a tool that can produce polished outputs that means that they don't have to do any work. The link between the work of becoming a nurse and the evidence of that becoming is now permanently broken. So I've seen institutions have two responses. They have discursive responses and structural responses. This is the work of Corbin and Dawson and Liu at the University of, I want to say, Sydney, but I could be wrong, or Deakin University, one of those. Anyway, there's a lot of really good research that's coming out of two or three Australian institutions, especially around AI and assessment. And they kind of have a really progressive, forward-thinking approach. And they talk about discursive and structural responses. And discursive responses are what almost everyone is doing. Updating policies, asking students to write AI declarations, traffic light systems, two-lane systems where you are either supervised or unsupervised. They're trying to change the language around assessment. These are defensive positions that leave the foundational assumptions intact and they maintain the status quo. All that these things do is they assume that we have to protect the artifact. We have to protect the thing that students are submitting and make sure that they're not using AI to produce those outputs. And this logic of artifact production leads to artifact protection, leads to arms race dynamics. It means that we are constantly in a battle with students to see who can catch them, and they're going to be spending all of their time figuring out how to not get caught. And this isn't really a good place, I think, for higher and professional education to be in. Structural responses aim to change the underlying conditions that determine what students think and do. They literally change how students behave and how students think in a way that still leads to learning. And discursive changes cannot address structural problems. We cannot expect that changing the words on our policy documents, producing new AI and assessment guidance, these things are not going to change the structural problem as long as we assume that the artifact has the answer to our students' learning. A lot of my colleagues have faith in more accurate AI detectors. All that we need is a better piece of technology, but we can't use technology to solve social problems. That's never worked, and I don't see a reason for why that's going to work now. All that an AI detector, even if we assume that AI detection is perfect, all that it tells you is that AI produced the artifact. It doesn't tell you about anything. It doesn't tell you anything about whether the student was cognitively engaged. You could outsource all of your administration to AI. AI could take over all of your, if you're a student, it can manage your calendar, for example. So everything about calendar, how should I respond to this invitation to go out? When are my classes? What shifts should I take at work? Outsource all of that to AI. I'm sure that that's going to be fine. Outsourcing your thinking to AI is less fine. In both cases, you've outsourced everything to AI. Just being able to tell that AI was involved in the production of an output doesn't tell you anything about the student's cognitive engagement with the work that produced the output. Those are different kinds of questions, and if we're just looking at detection, it answers the wrong question. I think AI can generate avoidance or genuine struggle. It can generate either avoidance or you can use it to engage in genuine struggle. The tools are the same, the output can be the same, but the formation isn't. I think we should shift from saying or from asking, did they use AI to what did they use AI for? It's a very different way of thinking about it. The first one closes it down. The first question tries to make sure that there's a space where students don't use AI. What if we assume that students will use AI and we start asking, what did they use AI for? So what are the kinds of things that educators might contribute into these interactions? We can start by looking at what AI can't do. And this isn't in the sense that we want to look at what they can't do so that we can fill in that space. It's trying to understand what value we can add that AI is unable to add at this moment. So language models are stateless. It means that they have no memory across sessions. And I should just separate out the language model to the product that companies have created. So when you're interacting with ChatGPT or Claude, there is an underlying language model, which is what this slide is describing. The companies have built a product around that language model, which does have memory. It does have access to tools and access to the internet. I'm talking about the AI beneath that product. So it has no memory across sessions. It's got no understanding of this patient, this ward, what's going on in this moment. It's got no understanding of your relationship with students. It's got no understanding of what your values are, what your preferences are. The knowledge is static, so that means it's frozen at the end of the training run. It can't update from any unfolding encounter. So continuous learning is the idea that AI will be able to learn and integrate information coming from encounters and hold on to that information. At the moment, it can't do that. Every interaction that you have with the AI, where you give it something of yourself, that gets lost almost immediately. Now, again, some of the products are able to save memories. If you use ChatGPT fairly regularly, you may have seen every now and again it'll pop up a little notification saying memory updated. And that's when it's made a decision about whether or not you've provided some piece of context that it might find useful in its future responses. It has no real context because it has no memory, it has no ability to understand and to uh, take on board things that you give it. So your values, your preferences, your beliefs, it's got no embodied experience of practice. It's not involved. It can't see what's going on in the classroom. It's got no stakes in the outcomes and it's got no accountability. I think most of the professional bodies, at least in the UK and in America, have said that the clinician is always responsible for patient outcomes, regardless of whether or not AI was involved in informing those decisions. So AI it doesn't understand it. Oh, let me start again. AI lacks a sense of meaning that comes from being present, responsible, and changed. And this kind of, for me, it started making me shift away from asking what can only humans do. So I don't want to look at AI and say what can't it do, and then those are the things that I can do. I want to ask, what can I contribute? What can I contribute to this interaction with AI, knowing that it has no memory, no knowledge past its kind of last training run, no experience of practice of the classroom of my students? What can I contribute to that interaction that might add value? I've been talking so far about AI in the sense of the kinds of things that you probably are used to. So ChatGPT, you go to a website, there's a little chat interface, you add some words, you might be able to upload a document if you're paying for the more expensive versions, you can upload a lot of documents. Um, we are moving away from that paradigm to agents, where agents are able to take actions. So you can give them a high level task and the AI can spawn sub agents, so different versions of itself. It can give each version of itself a different task that it can then go off and complete. So agents can take actions. They search, they can synthesize information, they can draft outputs, they can write critiques, they iterate, they can get feedback on their performance and then change the performance so that they do better the next time. They can do real work in collaboration with the student. They're not just responding to students, they can work with students in an iterative fashion over time. I think that we need to shift the way that we think about AI to the ability to direct an agent well. And if you can do that, you can create a scaffold that allows you to surface harder problems. You can challenge reasoning with more depth and raise the engageable ceilings. I said right at the very beginning, we want motivated and engaged students. And that part of learning is going to require them to have to experience cognitive difficulty. They need to engage with difficult problems. What we don't want is for them to hand off all of that problem solving to AI. So the question is not whether students will have agents, because they already do, but how are we designing experiences that support effective learning? At the moment, access to AI is unevenly distributed. We can't make assumptions that every student is going to arrive in the classroom with capable agents that can build existing advantage into the design. The equity question is structural. And what that means is we need to design environments where we assume that not every student is going to have not only access to AI agents, but they don't have access to the knowledge that they need to use those agents most effectively. I think this is a little bit like teaching students that how to log into the internet and say, well, now they have the internet, now they have access to all human knowledge, now they will be able to learn. We need to give them the tools to be able to critically analyze that information, synthesize that information, and make informed choices using that information. Just giving someone access to a tool doesn't mean that they can use it effectively. We know that sending someone to the gym to do your workouts is an absurd statement. You would never expect that to to have any impact, obviously. And yet, somehow we've created an environment where students don't think it's unreasonable to have someone else do the cognitive work that they need in order to learn. And that's because learning is not the thing that is valued, it's the grade that's valued. It's the quality of the work that they submit. And if they can get something to help them submit something that has better quality, well, then that just seems to be the reasonable and rational choice. We need to get the learning environment structured in a way that students understand that outsourcing the cognitive difficulty of learning is as absurd as asking someone else to go to the gym on your behalf. So, what are the kinds of conditions that support that cognitive struggle? Now, a lot of this is driven by problem and project-based learning. These are not new ideas. This has been in the literature for a really long time. But I think this pushes us away from the kinds of things that we typically do in our higher education environments. It's not unreasonable to walk into any university classroom and see someone talking at students for 2 hours. And I'm not saying that that's how your classrooms are, but I think the majority of higher education classrooms are just students listening to someone else talking at them. We know that there are better ways for students to engage, and this is just some of those different ways. And what I like about these is that you bring AI into the process, and AI can make this process better. So we can look at problem-driven inquiry. These are just problem-based learning scenarios. They can create situations of uncertainty from the beginning. There are no clean solutions. We try to make everything neat in the classroom. And the reality is that the world is not neat. The world is messy and uncomfortable and difficult. And sometimes we have to make choices for which there are no correct solutions. We should be bringing some of those things into the classroom. And what happens when we bring AI into that conversation is that the AI can help students navigate that uncertainty. They don't need to find the clean solution. AI can help them sit with the difficulty and discomfort. Collaborative construction, where engagement is visible and challengeable. Students need to be able to take positions and defend those positions, either against kind of critiques from their classmates or from facilitators or from an AI. We can have an AI as part of that learning interaction where the AI challenges the student. So rather than thinking of AI as an answer generating machine, think of AI as a critical friend or peer, where it can ask the students to defend positions that they hold. We need to look at facilitation over instruction, where lecturers can kind of step back. We've seen this for the last 20 years. We need to move away from the sage and the stage to the guide on the side. So how do we have someone in the classroom who can hold the process, who can look at it from that high level view, who can scaffold everything that's going on, but they don't need to provide the answer. The struggle needs to stay with the student. And that can be uncomfortable, not only for the student, but for the lecturer, because it may be the case that students walk out of the classroom without having a clear solution to the problem that you've given them. But again, this models practice. How many times do you leave the clinical environment not having a clear answer to something that's going on in the working space? We know that reflection is really important. Reflection makes developing judgment visible to the student and to the assessor. You can have an AI do all of your reflection for you. But again, we're trying to provide this environment, or trying to create this environment where that would be as ridiculous to the student as asking someone else to go to the gym on their behalf. Why on earth would you get an AI to write your reflection when you know that the only way for you to develop good judgment is for you to write that reflection? All these conditions require students to make a choice. It's not that we just have to implement PBL and that will solve the AI problem. You can do PBL with an AI where the student does no work. There is no learning environment anymore where AI does not at least provide the option for the student to completely sidestep everything. We need to create an environment where the student makes a choice to engage with the cognitive difficulty. So I started off talking about the work and asking, what is the work? The work isn't the artifact that you produce. It's not the polished essay or poster that the student creates. The work is what happens to you while you engage with the struggle that builds new understanding. The student is engaged, directing, evaluating, being challenged, being changed. They are doing the work, whether an AI is involved or not. Our task is not to prevent AI from doing the work. It's to design conditions where students choose not to outsource the struggle that drives their learning. This misalignment has always been there. This is not an AI problem, but AI has made it impossible for us to keep optimizing the artifacts that students create. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Michael. That was incredible. I would like to open this up for Q&A. So if you would like to pop something in the chat, or if you'd like to raise your hand, we can unmute you as well. Pardon me. While we are waiting for any questions, I will share that Kristen dropped a note. She did have to jump, and she inquired whether or not the recording would be available. She did say that this is one of the most impactful webinars she's attended. So just for everyone's knowledge, this will be posted on the on-demand webinar section of GRNEN's website in the next day or so. We will drop a note in the community to let you know that it is available. So please feel free to revert back to that if you have anything that you want to reference, and share it with colleagues as well. So does anybody have any questions? Okay. Well, if something comes up after the fact, you can always reach out to me at info@grnen.com, and we will make sure that Michael receives those questions. And I want to thank you so much for putting that together, for volunteering your time to share your expertise with our audience. That was incredible. We're very, very grateful for your participation today. Thank you, Michael.
It's my pleasure. And I'm happy for you to share my email address if anybody wants to contact me directly.
Okay, I can drop that right in the chat as well if you want.
Yeah, yeah, no problem at all.
Will do. Let me grab that. And so we will pop that in. And thank you, everyone, for your time today. Enjoy the rest of your morning, your evening, your afternoon, wherever you're located today. And we look forward to seeing you at our next session. Bye, everyone.
Thanks very much. Bye bye.